Hello, everyone. I'm going to give it just a second while people join us. Good afternoon. Thank you very much, all of you out there in Los Angeles and Indian country and beyond who have joined us for this exciting talk today on a coalition of lineages. We are really excited to welcome our honored guests. Before we do, I wanted to just first acknowledge that we are on the land of the Tongva peoples, the caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. And we're grateful very much that we could be present on these lands today. So thank you for that. I'm Angela Riley. I am a law professor here at UCLA, and I'm director of the Native Nations Law and Policy Center. And we're just honored to be able to highlight this incredible work by two of my colleagues, Professors Carol Goldberg and Dwayne Champagne, who I will introduce more fully in a moment. And also really delighted to have our guest speaker as well, President Rudy Ortega, who is the tribal president of the Fernandeño Tataviam. So we are just honored to be able to host this here at UCLA, although I'm in my home office, not in my campus office. And before I do the introductions of our speakers, I'd like to just give a warm thank you to Dean Jennifer Mnookin, who's supported much of the research that went into this book and has supported the Native Nations Law and Policy Center and has agreed to take a few moments to welcome all of you to this hybrid Zoom event. So I'll turn it over now to our amazing, wonderful Dean, Dean Jennifer Mnookin.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Riley. And it's just a pleasure to be here and to just get to say a few introductory words. What Carol Goldberg and Dwayne Champagne have done over their careers is just pretty extraordinary, and it's just a delight to get to have this book celebration now of their latest work. As many of you on this call know, Professor Riley directs our Native Nations Law and Policy Center, the NNLPC, and that supports career advancement as well as intellectual engagement in the field of federal Indian law, and to work on Native recruitment to the law school too. That's really important to us. It's also an umbrella organization at the law school, and a lot of things happen underneath it. The joint degree program in Law and American Indian Studies, which obviously American Indian Studies is also deeply involved in, the Tribal Development Clinic, which we're really proud of, as well as the Tribal Learning Community and Educational Exchange, which is also really significant to us. And I'm proud that we have a long tradition in the fields of federal Indian law and tribal law, and Carol and Dwayne are certainly a big part of that. American Indian law has been a part of UCLA's curriculum, going back until at least the 1970s, first under the leadership of Professor Reed Chambers and Professor Monroe Price. Professor Price went on to help found the California Indian Legal Services and the Native American Rights Fund, two obviously preeminent legal services organizations advancing the rights of tribes and Native peoples. I believe that Professor Price also visited at Stanford Law School when Carol Goldberg was a student there, and that's part of what helped take her on the really extraordinary career trajectory that she's had. She joined the UCLA law faculty in 1972. She was 12, I think, at that point, or something like that, given her youthfulness. And she was one of our very first female faculty members. She wrote a groundbreaking article in 1975 on Public Law 280, published in our own UCLA Law Review. And it was the first substantive legal analysis of a law that impacts hundreds of tribes, including within the state of California. And it really helped pave the way for future holdings on tribal sovereignty, including what led to the right for tribes to engage in gaming. She's got way more accomplishments than I could possibly mention, but one of the things she also did is help start our own tribal legal development clinic. And today that clinic is funded through a generous gift from the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, and that lets that clinic operate year round. And we're thrilled to have it. And we're thrilled to have Lauren Van Schliffgaard as our superb director of that clinic. We also, I'm so proud that in recognition of UCLA's historic and ongoing commitment to the advancement of American Indian law and tribal engagement, we received a $15 million gift last year from the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria to fund full tuition scholarships for students with a focus on tribal advocacy and American Indian law. It's really a transformative opportunity. And I know that Great Rancheria was interested in it because of both our past successes in this space, as well as the ongoing leadership that still includes Carol and Angela Riley. I also want to say that Dwayne Champagne has also had a tremendous career and made just such significant contributions. He's also held a joint appointment here at the law school, and he was really the key creator behind TILSI, which is a piece of our Native Nations program and its tremendous community engagement part. And he's also hugely supported our joint degree program with classes and supervision. Carol and Dwayne are also a powerhouse scholarship partnership and doing amazing work. And that's really what you're going to hear about more today. And we're tremendously proud today to welcome President Ortega, the tribal president of the Fernandeño Tataviam Band of Mission Indians. We've had the honor of working alongside the Tataviam Band on several projects and presentations, including through the Tribal Development Clinic. And we're really delighted to support Professor Goldberg and Professor Champagne's research in partnership with the tribe. I am definitely going to stop here because none of you is here to listen to me, but I hope I've given you some sense of both Carol and Dwayne and Angela and Lauren and President Ortega's strengths. And I really look forward to being able to be here for the first part of this talk. Take care.
Thank you so much, Dean Mnookin, and thank you for being here. You've already heard a little bit about our professors, so I'm going to give slightly truncated bios, but I encourage you to look them up online if you want more information. I have to say, of course, Professors Goldberg and Champagne are two of my own personal mentors and heroes who've given me enormous amount of professional and personal guidance over the years, including with Professor Champagne being a longtime director of the UCLA American Indian Studies Center and bringing it to really national and international prominence, a role that I filled after him for a certain period of time. So let me start by introducing the professors and then introduce President Ortega. Dwayne Champagne is a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians. He's a professor of sociology at UCLA, though now emeritus. He directed, as I mentioned, the UCLA American Indian Studies Center from 1991 through 2002, and was also a longtime editor of the American Indian Culture and Research Journal. He's done extensive research on social and cultural change, both historically and in contemporary Native American communities, and has authored over 135 publications, just really remarkable, including numerous books, Notes from the Center of and Captured Justice, Native Nations and Public Law 280 with Professor Goldberg, among others. So welcome, Professor Champagne. Professor Carol Goldberg is Distinguished Research Professor of Law and the Jonathan D. Barrett Distinguished Professor of Law Emerita at UCLA. She's Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals of the Wallapai Tribe. She served as the Oneida Indian Nation Visiting Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and was one of President Barack Obama's 3 appointees to the Indian Law and Order Commission. In 2013, the Federal Bar Association's Indian Law section presented her with its Lawrence Baca Lifetime Achievement Award, and she's written extensively about criminal justice, tribal sovereignty, cultural resources, equal protection, among many other topics, including her groundbreaking work on Public Law 280, and is also one of the co-authors and co-editors of the treatise, foremost treatise in the field, the Cohen's Handbook on Federal Indian Law. So welcome to Professor Goldberg. And I'd also like to welcome our special guest here, President Rudy Ortega, who's the tribal president of the Fernandeño Tataviam Band of Mission Indians, and also a traditional leader within his tribe. He's followed in the footsteps of his father, Rudy Ortega Sr., who served as the leader of the tribe for over 50 years, and in 1977 was elected to the Los Angeles City and County Native American Indian Commission. President Ortega has followed in his father's footsteps and was appointed to the commission himself by Mayor James Hahn in 2004 and currently serves as its vice chair. His engagement in the Los Angeles region around environmental, cultural, and Indigenous issues is extensive, including serving as the executive director of PUCU, Cultural Community Services, the tribe's nonprofit, and has also managed Haramagna, American Indian Cultural Center. I hope I said that right. And he's also a member of the Los Angeles River Master Plan Steering Committee, the Santa Clarita Watershed Recreation and Conservation Authority, and the Edison Consumer Advisory Panel Board and state liaison for tribal, the state tribal liaison for the Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. We've had the privilege here at UCLA of having engagement, as Dean Mnookin said, with the Tataviam, and we're just really deeply impressed and moved by your leadership, President Ortega, and all of the things that you and your community have done here in Los Angeles and in the region. And so thank you for taking time out today to be here. So I want to turn it over to you now to say a few words yourself about the tribe's role and relationship to this incredible project, and also what motivates the book and set some of this in context for us.
No, thank you, Angela, for that. And just a little minor update on my bio that you mentioned. Everything is wonderful. I'm now, the PUCU organization, a nonprofit that started in the 70s, which actually is now the executive director is Eric Sanchez, who's an alum from UCLA as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And our relationship with UCLA is very extensive. As you mentioned, we work continuously with UCLA and other campuses as well as those in the San Fernando Valley, like CSUN. But we enjoy a relationship and always having that bridge and networking with the students and the faculty there. And hence our lead professor and research team here for our federal recognition is both Carol and Dwayne Champagne, who's written the book. And the inspiration of the book is really the history of the tribe, the struggles, the navigation. And there's not much of my or own family feelings behind it, but also the tribal community inside the tribe. So many of our tribal people always ask the questions and wanted to know the history intensively of who we are as people and what village do we come from, and why are we struggling so much. And so a lot of questions, and that book is really an inspiration to many of our tribal people who want to know the family legacies, the histories, the stories. And so that's what really brought the motivation, and really Carol and Dwayne to take that hurdle and navigate through the years of research and study, and we're crafting and writing the book. So a little bit of my tribe, we're Mission Indians from San Fernando. We descend from roughly 26 villages that were encompassed to Mission San Fernando. There's a lot more villages, but those are the villages that we're associated with. Within those villages, there's 3 lineages that survive today, and those 3 lineages are enrolled in our contemporary tribe today. That's the Fernandeño Tataviam band of Mission Indians. And throughout that region, what is Fernandeño? So we get a question of, and the other question we get is, what is a band? And it's this complexity of a network system. And both Dwayne and Carol could, well, Dwayne really loves it because he's a social, professor, and he loves the social interaction among human beings and people. And so he really documented the family's history. But, that's the complexity of our tribal network, is that we're not a singular one speaking language of people or culture. We're a multiple complexity of people intermarrying with each other in this region. And this region encompasses the San Fernando Valley, Simi Valley, Santa Clarita, and Antelope Valley. So within that complexity, there's 2 different language speaking folks and then multiple dialects in that language area. So you got from what is the contemporary language names of Serrano, Fernandeño, Gabrielino languages to Chumash languages, and then Chumash language in different dialects. So you can just imagine the people were very intelligent our ancestors were very intelligent in order to speak all those different dialects and engage with each other and network and have social, economic, and many other things. So, and along with the cultural aspects, throughout this whole region, our ancestors study astronomy, many different sciences that they learn to live and adapt to the land. And those techniques, as much of them have vanished, we maintain some of it. So that's really, in pursuing, one of the big things is, as I mentioned, we're Dwayne and Carol are part of our federal recognition team as we pursue federal acknowledgement. How do we answer to the department and the federal government and describe who we are as a tribe? And that's a complex. Everyone knows that the federal 7 criterions are very difficult and challenging and overcumbersome. And one thing that we had to do is just paint our picture of who we are as people and be true to the story of who we are as a tribal community. And that's something that we had to navigate through the federal process with. So with this book, as I mentioned, with my own people that were ecstatic about having a book of the tribe itself, is to really unpack and learn who we are as tribal people, educate the next generations to come, share the stories, because so much of it, of our history here in Los Angeles and my relatives to the east, the Gabrielino Tongva people, we all feel the same. We always get shoved to the shadows, pushed to the side and forgotten. And in my tribe, more so than anything else, is that we've always forgotten because we're in the northern end of Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles. We tend to be forgotten, we tend to be lost, we tend to be pushed into the shuffle. So that's what this book brings to us. It brings forward our story. It brings who we are as people, brings us who we are as a tribe. And then the biggest thing between Carol and I is we need a Netflix series or what is it, Apple Syndicate or something. So that's the next step after this book. So, but again, thank you very much for inviting me to speak and speak a little bit about our tribe.
Thank you so much, President Ortega. And I know that Professors Goldberg and Champagne will speak to this and the collaboration with the tribe in the process of writing the book, which I'll get to in the Q&A, but I'm sure they would agree that this project couldn't have been possible without their relationship to you and your community. So I'm sure we're all deeply grateful for that. Well, without further ado, and I'm sorry, I don't have my physical book here with me because I was reading it in my office and then I left it there, my other office. So hopefully someone can hold it up. Thank you, Carol. There it is, and it's a beautiful cover too. It's a beautiful book. I'm going to turn it over to Professors Goldberg and Champagne, who I think want to share a PowerPoint, give them an opportunity to present and sort of sketch out the book, and then we'll have some conversation when they're finished.
Thank you so much, both to Dean Mnookin, to you, Professor Riley, to President Ortega for very gracious introductions. And we will begin with this presentation, which will only give you a smattering of what's in the book, just to whet your appetites. There are 57 photographs and 7 specially commissioned maps in this book, and we are going to provide you with some examples of them in this presentation. And I believe you can now all see this. So just in case you didn't see the book that I held up, here is the book cover. You can see it's long. That's because it has a number of appendices with a glossary and lots of genealogical information in it, as well as many, many notes. But we're going to begin with one of our maps.
This is a map that's very important to us. It shows the complexity of language in the region that Rudy already alluded to. We have Venturino, which is the Chumash groups, and the Tataviam, Serrano, Catambac, who have something more related languages, Utu Aztecan groups. But in the literature, there's a tendency for maps of similar linguistic groups, like the Venturino here. But for us, we needed something that would present the complexity of the political complexity of the region. And so we're looking at villages, and from other sources, the villages are very important. They have territory, they have a lot of autonomy, they share meetings and ceremonies with other groups within these regions. But the villages are, from our point of view, the most powerful political groupings. And so that this map is designed to show the linguistic relationships, but at the same time show that the villages, we have just a small group of them that populate this area. The numbers are probably much larger. And so here we have both linguistic and political identity. And so that we think that's very important for understanding what happens later.
And just to situate those villages in relation to contemporary geographical markers, we created this map as well so that you can see how widely these villages populated the northern Los Angeles Basin area. You can see San Fernando and the adjacent village of Pasanga, which is the village that was closest to where the mission was established. There's a large range, a large area in both Ventura and Los Angeles County, which was the area from which Mission San Fernando was drawing individuals. And this began when the mission was established in 1797. It was one of the later missions.
Here we have a map and an estimation of the boundaries of the mission, San Fernando mission. And you can recognize some of the names here, like Encino. That's a Spanish name, but that's one of the villages. Tahunga, Cahuenga, down in the right corner. Those are old villages, and as well as Triunfo and Cumulus. This particular piece of land has great importance for the story and for the communities. It's all part of Spanish colonialism, and it's a piece of land that's designated to be delivered to the tribal groups. The tribal groups, like the many villages, were gathered together at San Fernando, and by 1797, probably within the first 10 years, they gathered a very large group of people, probably several, maybe 500 or 600. Eventually, as many as 1,000 people were at San Fernando Mission at a time, Indian people from the surrounding villages. But this particular piece of land was designated to be given to the Indians in the post-colonial period, or when the mission would be secularized and the land would be turned out over to Indian communities where they could farm and have a living and have leadership, political Pueblo identity, in which they would become citizens of Spain or Mexico.
So 1797 is when the mission is established, with this understanding, as Dwayne has pointed out, that eventually at least some of that mission territory would be allocated for pueblos for the Indians who were brought there. The plan was to force them basically to assimilate and to become farmers, which they had not been previously, and to organize them in villages that would be part of the Spanish, later the Mexican state. That was ultimately the plan. The amount of time available for this kind of forced assimilation actually wasn't very great, because in 1821, Mexico acquires its independence from Spain. And by the 1830s, the Mexican government, with pressure from local Mexican citizens, is trying to secularize the missions and make the land which is valuable in these missions available to non-native people, citizens of Mexico. In the course of all this, the Indians at the mission realize that things are disintegrating, and they want to make sure that they have some base of land for themselves. And so a group of them, 40 of the Fernandeños, come together in a petition to the Mexican governor, Manuel Micheltorena, to secure a grant of land, which they do receive from him. And one of the things we were able to find in the archives was the map. This is how land grants were depicted in those days. a map showing this grant. One of the important features of this petition and subsequent grant is that it shows the cohesion, the joining together of different village lineages into a kind of collective at the mission. They were electing what the Spanish and Mexican called alcaldes as supposed leaders. They were very much under the control of the mission. But there was, to some degree, overlapping with their lineage identities and political forms, a kind of collective identity and organization as a tribe that viewed itself as Fernandeño. And this turned out to be very important in the presentation to the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, which is going to be considering a petition from the Fernandeño Tataviam for federal recognition. They wanted to see a tribe having been formed at the mission. And we wanted to be very clear that although there was this collective identity and some organization created at the mission, it did not supplant the underlying and vital village lineage organization that had preceded the mission and continued on, which we were able to document through things like some of the words that were used to describe leaders who were among those at the mission.
This particular map is very interesting. The 40 petitioners, they in fact inherited a piece of land. You can see here at the very bottom of the left corner, there's sort of a measure for miles. And also the land is between the two trees. And so the deeds in those days are largely descriptions like that. There's rocks or trees, that's all the boundaries. But this is sets up a piece of land that the 40 petitioners can actually farm. And they would live in a village that actually is not very far from that. And in this particular map is also the house of Samuel. You see the picture of the house. That was one of the Indians from the same village actually as the Tataviam, or from one of the Tataviam villages. And he was a lead farmer, and he was very well regarded among the leadership of the mission.
One of our goals in the book was to document the unjust dispossessions that occurred over the course of the later 19th and 20th century. And the 40 petitioners and their grant of land were part of this unjust dispossession process. We also wanted to, well, Dwayne, I think this is you.
Well, this is a map of the various land grants that are made to Indians and sometimes the non-Indians. But this is the land that the Indians were living on during the mission period. They had been living in many other places, but much farther away in many instances. But here we're just trying to capture the land grants that were given, which was in the mission to the mission, and to the and some of them like a Scorpion on the left is the Shumash group was took that over. Encino was in fact the homeland of the Ortega family. And so that they inherited or were given in about 1844, 45, a land grant. The 40 petitioners are there. They're about 1843, and Samuel with his house had 200 acres. And the whole area in the American period was called the Mission San Fernando. And this was the land that was very highly contested. Although the Indians got Cahuenga and the Scorpion and Encino and the land of the 40 petitioners, they were not able to hold on to very much of this land at all.
Yeah. And the Mission San Fernando was a major Mexican grant that was made to a non-native, Logio de Silas, and it was made right out without regard to the grant to the 40 petitioners. It was, and later confirmed by the US government without regard to that grant for the 40 petitioners. And by the way, the grant to the 40 petitioners was also conditioned on it not being alienated. So it was definitely understood to be a collective homeland for the people. As a consequence of this grant to de Silas of the Mission San Fernando, there were a lot of people, Indians from the mission, who were still living in that area, but the owners who acquired the Mission from de Silas decided they needed to be evicted, and they were. This is a picture of Rogerio Rocha, who was one of the most prominent leaders of the Fernandeños during the late 19th and first years of the 20th century. He was one of those, along with an ancestor of President Ortega, who were evicted from the ex-mission lands as a result of the grant that was made by Pio Pico, who was governor right before the Americans took over, and that was later confirmed by the US government, by the Land Commission. But there are many tribal members, Fernandeños, who during the 20th century were involved in land claims cases that the US government established, who identified Rogerio Rocha as their captain. And he was, during the time when he did have the land, someone who looked after the whole community.
Well, this is a major jump in time from Rogerio, who died in 1904, and into this is probably in about in 1971. And to the left is actually Rudy's father, Rudy Ortega Sr., who is the captain. And Rudy, both Junior and Senior, are descendants of chiefs, and were living in San Fernando in probably in the late 1870s, 80s, and up through to the present, frankly, are still living in the I am. Here, they're actually looking at a site that was discovered at Rocketdyne. Actually, they were building rockets for them to fly to the moon at that point, and they were testing them out in that area. And they found, working into the area, they found these caves, and so Rudy started a long tradition here of trying to preserve sacred sites. And so that was our cultural resources that we see today. And so this was the very beginning of that. And he was very, he was able to actually create a situation where some of the local museums and historical societies could actually provide protection for some of the wall paintings and other materials or reviews.
So here is another one of the leaders of the Fernandeños, Captain Charlie Cook. He's from a different lineage than the Ortegas. And Dwayne and I both got to know Charlie because of his very active involvement in cultural resource and other indigenous issues in the Los Angeles area. The book is titled A Coalition of Lineages because what we're trying to demonstrate is that these lineages had connections with one another in the pre-mission period through ceremonies, through intermarriage, through trade. And those linkages continue. So one of the Charlie Cook lineage ancestors was a sibling of one of the ancestors of the Ortega lineage. And their connections over time were maintained, and that's one of the ways in which the continuity of social and political organization is being depicted for the Office of Federal Acknowledgement. And here is our last slide.
Okay, this is a slide of Rudy, who made various kinds of agreements to make a village at Comulus or Rancho Comulus. It's very near to each other. Rudy is here, I think, accepting, or talking about the finishing of making a village, which is in the background there.
And Camelos was one of the sites that was the object of another unjust dispossession, where the whole village site was made the object of a Mexican land grant. And there was actually quite a bit of protest from the local people as a result of that. But unfortunately, the US government again approved this land grant. So
well, actually, that land grant was a part of the ancestral territory of Rudy in the Ortega family. It's called San Francisco, or Rancho San Francisco, but it's actually the village of Chiguayanga, which in fact Rudy's ancestors come from.
Wonderful. So we're going to stop sharing and be available for questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I know that as we said before the program started, you were only going to be able to scratch the surface. And I think that goes to my first question, which is, I know that you all worked on this book for many, many years and did extensive research, obviously. So my first question is just, could you describe a little bit of your research methods? How did you go about uncovering all these things? I mean, I found that hand-drawn map to just be completely remarkable. And I'm sure there are many, many treasures in putting the book together. So how did you engage in the research for the project? And then sort of a related question, because the project was of dual purpose, that you were working both to support the tribe's petition for recognition, but also to produce a scholarly work, how did that impact your research methods as you researched for the book?
Interesting question. I'm not. Well, we worked together, and there were certain legal issues that were attached to this particular project. So Carol is, of course, an expert in that kind of stuff, and so she spent a lot of time on it. My interests have been largely cultural and historical, and so that fit quite nicely with my actually interests, and so. So digging up, information about tribal activities and tribal stories it's very exciting for me, and it's also the kind of thing I'm interested in intellectually, and so it became actually an obsession, probably more than it should have, perhaps, but it turned out in many ways we even during the down periods, we kept on searching and finding things, which kept us alive to go look for more, and legal stuff as well as ethnographic stuff, and so it combined together quite well, I think, in the end.
We had to use a huge smorgasbord of methods to pursue this book. There's no one discipline, I think, that could claim it. We did an immense amount of archival research. We spent a lot of time at the Huntington Library and then at subsidiary libraries, including at the Southwest Museum, the National Archives, local federal archives. Numerous haystacks were explored. And needles found occasionally, but there was a lot of haystack time. But that wasn't the only kind of research we did. We did a lot of genealogical research, which required going through a lot of documentary sources that we weren't necessarily all that familiar with, many of which were in Spanish, and we had to hire experts to do that. We used a lot of student research support in doing the archival research. We also did some very significant number of oral history interviews. We had an anthropologist who was a UCLA graduate, but teaching at USC, who was co-author with me in another book, who was very good at doing many of these. Dwayne did some of the oral history interviews himself. We had them all transcribed. We relied very heavily on the partnership with the tribe. We had access to people's individual photo books, their photo albums. We groaned and moaned every time somebody told us they had recently cleaned out their garage, because oftentimes there were boxes of books that could be enormously helpful to us, or papers or clippings or whatever. I'm sure that there's a lot that we found on the internet that we would not normally find in decades earlier.
One of the things I would say that was rather fantastic about the research is that everything in recent years can be digitized, and so instead of handling paper, we were doing a lot of stuff in digital form, which allowed us to organize and transport and the information. And I think that without it, I don't think we could have ever done it.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Rudy carries around, I don't know, about 6 or 7, gigabytes of data and stuff. And in trying, creating it, as well as trying to sort it out and present it, all our little problems to try to solve.
And it's worth emphasizing that the question you asked about the connection between doing it as part of a federal recognition effort is an important one, because the Office of Federal Acknowledgement has its own expectations and requirements about how a petition is documented. They want excruciatingly detailed support for absolutely everything, including during periods of time when the tribe and its members were fearful of discrimination. They were fearful that they were going to be removed to a distant reservation and away from their homeland. And so they weren't in the business of documenting things and taking minutes and using sign-in sheets for their basically lineage and extended family events, where they might be actually making important political decisions, like, do we participate in a particular land claim process that the federal government has created, or do we not? So we did some of the oral history interview to fill in some of the information that might otherwise be provided to OFA, the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, in more documentary form. Also, they are just insistent that they get original documents rather than anything else. So you can't cite to a page of a book, for example. You have to provide them with a PDF of the page or the whole book. Another amazing example is that the Huntington Library fully digitized all of the mission records from all of the California missions, and it was a huge help to us to be able to use this. But then it turned out that the Office of Federal Acknowledgement would only accept the original Spanish language documents that were in the archive at the Santa Barbara mission. And so we had to run back, and after we had provided all of this information from the Huntington, we had to go back and get the original documents.
Actually, for many years, we did not know where those documents were. And only in recent years, we actually found them.
Wow, that's just remarkable. And your answers sort of lead me to another question, which is I'm curious about, one is, obviously this is a collaboration with the tribe. So if you could talk a little bit about how that collaboration really formed the book, and if it guided your path or your research at all. As we all know, with increased emphasis on work with Indigenous peoples actually being in collaboration with Indigenous peoples instead of sort of externally conducted. How did the tribe figure into this, and how did that collaboration help to make the project what it was?
Well, that's actually an interesting question. I got the sense that there were, that of course, nobody is going back, into their own history or their community's history. It's very rare. I get the sense of very unusual. And so one of the nice things about the business was that we could find things like some of the land grants and things like that the tribe didn't know about, and therefore could bring that into some kind of understanding, and they could understand who they were more better, and because they would claim this territory or it had once been theirs. And that also helped with identifying themselves for the purposes of the recognition. And so I thought that stuff was very positive when we could find those things, and it's also useful to especially the interviews had lots of fantastic information in them. I mean, there were some of the people have already passed, but they were very learned in who they were and what they were about. And unfortunately, the OFA does not like oral histories, and so how much evidence we can get out of them. But we wrote the story up with the oral evidence, because that was where the story was. That none of this stuff was ever written down, and so there's really great history and stuff. In particular, Rudy Jr.'s father and grandfather and great-grandfather. Most of we do have documentation of them, but most of it is through the oral histories. And so,
and we did regular presentations of the work in progress to tribal meetings, and that was invaluable because we could get people to come forward and say, "Oh, this is a gap of your information, but I think I have some photographs at home that might really supply what you're looking for." So we felt very strongly that there was a synergy between our work and the community as a whole. At the same time, we're producing a work that is got to go through a process of peer review. I mean, it's got to meet scholarly standards, or frankly, it's not going to be helpful to them. And we knew that from the beginning. And, I think we were feeling very strongly that there was a convergence here, that what we were developing in a scholarly way was also going to be very helpful to them.
Yeah, I thought it was very cutting edge in many ways, and there's lots of controversies in those literatures, of course, like everywhere else. But we had a particular angle on it. Actually, the tribal angle was virtually missing from the literature. And so that was a wide open road for us, and we could interpret things in lots of different ways, and came up with, I think sometimes more comprehensive and more valuable interpretations, actually, for academia as well as for the tribe.
Well, I think it's it is very cutting edge, and I think it's very innovative the way that you've woven all of this together. And it leads to my next question, which you've touched on a little bit, but one of you is a legal scholar, the other is a sociologist. So you have an interdisciplinary approach, obviously, to the book, to the research and the work. So I'm curious, one, how does the interdisciplinary nature of the project, how did it help to propel the project forward, or in some cases, if it didn't propel it forward? And I'm also curious what other disciplines or expertise would have been interesting or fun to have had injected. And it sounds like you did seek some other experts in doing the research and writing the book. So talk a little bit about the interdisciplinary nature of this and how that developed.
Well, I think that we have our own disciplines, and in many ways they complement it, especially when we're talking about legal things and about the history of the legal things, but not always. There are certain kinds of ideas and interpretations that in say sociology that are very different than law. Logic and argument, very different. I mean, what we would take as valuable information, the law people don't think is worth working with. So so there were lots of times where we complimented, but many times when we didn't. And we had fun, and sometimes not so much fun, arguing about those and stomping in our own forts or
Corners.
our own tents and stuff. There's a lot of compromise. You have to sort of, especially when it's another discipline and that's a deep thing, and you can't really get that if you're not an outsider. So you have to be try to be understanding, but at times we had our difficulties on that.
We spent a lot of time talking about this book, I will tell you, and the whole project. When you're collaborators and your spouses, there aren't a lot of boundaries that would demarcate when you do and don't talk about it. But I think there was a lot of mutual respect, a lot of willingness to at least give the first word, if not the last word, to each other. A lot of need to explain one's discipline to the other, which is really helpful in teasing out what might be either ambiguous or questionable, or perhaps a little opaque, and to make it more understandable to people outside your field.
But I think the multidisciplinary character actually enriched the book in many ways. It gives different understandings of it. I think we're very helpful to it.
I mean, our method of and it's not just for this book, it was also for Captured Justice, is we don't try to jointly write each chapter. We allocate those and then pass them back and forth, and talk a lot about it in between. There's certainly an imprint in different parts of the book that's more from one discipline than another, but always blended. Where else did we turn? Well, we relied a lot on anthropology, especially for a lot of the early work about the lineages and villages and their forms of organization.
Well, just so I can pitch in here, one of the, I think, advantages of me being a sociologist was my training was much different than the anthropologist. And so when I come to the same literature, I'm thinking about, social changes in social relationships and understanding and people during the colonial period. And so many of the early anthropologists are stopping before 1850 and just not working anymore, and socially and politically. But this in a certain sense, we're able to bridge that gap of being interested enough in the social and cultural relationships of the communities in the very beginning, and what is their culture and how do they view the world. We're writing the book for the tribe. We're trying to understand their point of view, and the actual process of change from the earlier period, the pre-colonial period, as well as the mission period and the secularization periods. All of that was game for us. That was, so we weren't tossing it to the side. In fact, with that, I don't think very many people have approached the world in the way that we did. And it was in transition in multiple periods, and we were trying to capture that transition. And when did you win? When did you lose? And things like that. And so I think that that was one of the perspectives we brought to the game that was rose naturally from the work, and were it's certainly I think an improvement on the existing literature in many ways.
Well, the interweaving is incredible and adeptly done. It's a beautiful book. I'm going to ask one last question, but before I do, I'm going to tell the audience that if they want to put a question in the chat, we have some time for Q&A at the end. And my colleague, Lauren Van Schulfgaard, is going to monitor the chat for me, and she's going to ask the questions here in a second so that I can focus on one thing at a time. But my last question is, being here in California, obviously, we're all very well aware of the problem of the lack of federal recognition of many tribes in the state, much of which seems to be an accident or consequence of just a really deplorable history, and then the lack of political will to right those wrongs. And I know there are a lot of Native people in California who are probably really interested in this work and interested in the federal recognition process and the petition. So I'm curious if you have, what are the takeaways from the project? What did you learn? Maybe roadblocks that you came up against that you figured out how to navigate around, and sort of what are the transferable lessons from this project that other people may be able to draw from in their own tribal experience?
That's a really good question and a dangerous question, actually. There are various criteria that that the OFA wants. They want you to define an historic, centralized, emphasis on centralized tribal community. In many ways, that's not California. I mean, it's decentralized villages that come together and during the mission period to form more centralized arrangements. So the early period is you can't support that particular criteria, and so you're looking at something during the mission period of some kind of centralization, and the missions all do force much more centralization, and so there's some kind of emergent political system, alcaldes, elected people that emerge for probably, I suspect, for all the mission Indians communities may have a chance because they have this period of mission, sort of interruption, and so they can form this, they manage that criteria. Otherwise, it's decentralized, the lineages, and it's very hard to pull them together unless you make an argument. I mean, there's some originality in making an argument that you can pull these groups together, politically and socially, and understand them that way.
Yeah, and I would just add that once OFA focuses on a centralized group at the mission, then it starts challenging, well, is your current day tribe consisting of all of the descendants of the people who were at the mission at that time? And if there is not sufficient number of descendants of those centralized mission group Indians, then OFA will knock out the petition because of it failing to include enough tribal members. And actually the decentralization, the number of different tribal groups within a single mission should not be a surprise given the way organization took place before the mission. What we found with the Fernandeños is, first of all, tragically, the number of survivors of Mission San Fernando was just not all that large, and fortunately for them, the lineages had enough connection with one another over, especially the 20th century, that they were able to show that these, different lineages, the main descendants from Mission San Fernando, were still all together in the tribe.
Some of the things that the Fernandeño Tataviam do may not occur with the other California groups, and so that's but that's an empirical question in the end. So, but they're unusual in many ways.
Well, it's just incredible. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Lauren Van Schulfgaard, who directs our Tribal Legal Development Clinic, and I'm going to mute my camera, and she'll ask the questions. I know we have a lot of questions in the chat in about 15 minutes. So Lauren, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. We have a number of really exciting questions, so I'll try and navigate them. As you can imagine, a lot of them center around federal recognition. And so I'll sort of dive into the middle here. Given the Spanish land grants, is there a place for a more extensive reconciliation process? The people lost their land grants and now it seems they need recognition before they have a land claim. Is that correct? Or is there a prior process with states around cultural resource and sacred site repatriation? So there's actually like 3 different questions in there.
Well, I think the issues of cultural resource protection and repatriation can and should be pursued independent of federal recognition. And the Native American Heritage Commission in California has really been pressing this point with state legislation that it's promoted, that incorporates and accommodates the claims of non-federally recognized tribes. So I think it's really important to do that. In terms of the land, one of the things we point out about the Fernandeños is that their ancestral territories turned out to be in a very highly valued location. And in fact, we were even able to find some statement in a federal hearing from the 1920s or early 30s, in which federal officials acknowledged that they never acquired land as part of the Mission Indian Act of the 1890s or through federal executive orders in the Los Angeles area, because it just would have been too much money from the point of view of the federal government. Even when the federal government did acquire land for tribes in, say, Riverside or San Bernardino County, they chose lands that were not desired by others, that were not very costly. Indeed, Florence Schippeck wrote that famous book, Pushed into the Rocks, to describe the land tenure in Southern California. Well, it wasn't even pushed into the rocks in Los Angeles County. The federal government just wouldn't do it. And the land claim that was approved for Mission San Fernando was approved based on an argument that was later rejected for Mission San Gabriel. So, there's a lot of room for reconciliation and recognition that this dispossession was unjust.
Considering that this is specifically in regards to a particular federal recognition matter, do we know the outcome of this process, or is it still in the works?
The one with the Tataviam now?
Yes.
It's in process.
Do we know where in the process?
Very supposedly they're scheduled. I don't know if I should give this information out, but I'll just say within a week or two. They're planning to deliver a new package, an updated package of petition materials. So we'll put in a whole new petition.
This is not not a fair question, it's my own, but considering that they're so insistent on original sources, how many pieces of paper do you think have been exchanged in part of this recognition process?
Oh God, there's thousands upon thousands.
Yeah, we're talking, of course, we do it digitally now, right? So we're talking what? I don't know the terminology as well as Dwayne does. Terabytes? I don't know.
Yeah, it's in the terabytes.
It's massive. It is totally massive. And we are the people who have to make sure that there's a scan of everything, that it's logged properly into a table, and that it's included in this, I'll use the word library of documents that goes to OFA. It's just unbelievable. And I should add first to thank again the deans of UCLA School of Law for supporting a lot of the research, because this was a joint scholarly project and a work of engaged scholarship for the Fernandeño Tataviam. We were able to gain support for this work that otherwise, on an hourly basis, I don't even want to think.
Now, OFA wants this monstrous amount of material in a certain way. And then for every document, you're supposed to argue why it actually accounts for the criteria. And so that they want you to write that on top for every document, it's an impossible task.
And organize it by decades This is hugely, hugely burdensome.
Well, in recognition of that burden, I'm going to try and collapse a couple of these questions that are sort of interrelated. You mentioned that you used some Indigenous language data to guide your interpretation. So there's a question about some examples of that, but also questions about considering how burdensome these regulations are. Is there any movement to modify this process, both to be reflective of the diversity and reality of tribes and their histories, but also to give credence to tribal oral history as evidence, including tribes' own perception of their history?
Yes, there have been efforts in the last 5 or 6 years to try to remedy those things to no real effect.
Yeah, some minor changes in the OFA regulations to acknowledge that there might be reasons why documents don't exist for particular periods of time. We have to explain why that might be. But it's still hugely challenging to be required to provide written documents in a form that would not be natural for a tribe to be using. In terms of the language, here's a good example. So the mission records for baptisms, marriages, deaths, and so on would often give the Indigenous name for the individual. And sometimes they would use names that we know from the Indigenous language signified political leadership, like Tomiar, which is a term still used among the Fernandeño. And so we could infer from the way these folks' names were listed that there was still an understanding of them as being in a political leadership position.
But I take it oral histories are not considered a sufficient resource to fill any like potential gap in the literature.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Good.
That's where sort of social sciences and law separate, because I think it's a legal argument, you know, because you know they don't take it as evidence if it's hearsay. And in sociology, they would, if it was in the right context, it could be, you know, this kind of information could be considered to be useful.
But we did our best to use rigorous methods to carry out these interviews, to use, you know, a professional anthropologist to, or sociologist to carry out these interviews. And we got a lot of them. So we're able to triangulate from a number of different interviews to support the same point.
But from a legal point of view, those arguments are self-serving, and so therefore suspect.
Which is ironic considering the dynamic between a nation-to-nation relationship.
Yeah, I mean, how much of what OFA is doing is self-serving?
It seems to be like they don't want to provide federal recognition. If I had to read the tea leaves.
Yeah. Really.
Professor Barra inquires as to whether or not anyone has sought from the UC Board of Regents a resolution supporting the petition for federal recognition. He knows the tribe obtained one from the school board, given the role of the state of California in the genocide and sabotaging of treaties and treaty making with California tribes. It seems different forms of state recognition might support the petition, given like a moral obligation to remedy some wrongs.
Well, the tribe has been very active in soliciting political support from other tribal governments, as well as from state governments. You know, OFA would view these as very recent forms of state recognition, and they're looking for continuity over decades. Yeah. So it's not necessarily a bad thing politically, but in terms of satisfying the criteria, it wouldn't help a whole lot, because there's a huge amount of evidence of tribal organization over the last 25 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not these most recent decades that are the burden.
Yeah, the hard part, yeah.
Well, we have, I think, about 3 minutes left. And so, apologies, we can't get to all the questions, but I wonder if we might use these last 3 minutes for any final words, including if President Ortega is still here.
Final words? Well, obviously we can't speak for President Ortega, but we can say that he has been extraordinarily supportive of this work. And we are immensely grateful to all of the leaders and membership of the Fernandeño Tataviam. We have called upon them for all kinds of assistance, helping us understand their family histories, providing us with wonderful, family memorabilia and information that they had, and people have been so exceptionally forthcoming. It's been a wonderful opportunity to also learn more about the history of this region. There's a lot of Los Angeles history that we were able to uncover through this that we think will have a very wide appeal, hence my continuing jokes with the president about a Netflix series. We learned, for example, that many of the folks honored with their names on streets and buildings and so on were actually some of the villains involved in the eviction of tribal members from lands that were their ancestral territory, and the subject of the grant to the 40 petitioners. We've uncovered a lot of local history as well as tribal history, and we think that would make the book of interest to a wider audience even.
Yeah, it sort of makes us think that there's a lot more history out there than most normal people know about. And maybe it's because it's Spanish and Mexican and Indian history. But I think that most Americans are thinking when they get off, a train in 1875, that the history starts then. And so that there's just a whole bunch of this. And I think that a lot of people would be surprised and interested to see the complexity and the interesting history that is Southern California.
So professors, where can we buy the book? Is it on campus? Is it being sold on campus?
You mean a physical book? Wow.
I like physical books.
I think you have to go to Amazon. There might be.
University of Arizona Press is making it available for sale as an ebook, as well as paperback and hardback copies. And I should know whether UCLA is offering it up, but I'm sure you can find it online.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for being here. Thank you, Lauren, for handling the questions, and to Heather, who was our administrative assistant who did a lot of the behind the scenes work. Thank you all out there in Indian country and Los Angeles greater area for joining us today for this incredible conversation with two of my most valued and esteemed colleagues. I love seeing you. Your work is inspirational and just mind-blowing what you've done here in this project. It's an incredible feat, and the legacy is amazing. So Chimegwech to you both, and thank you all, and look for our next and future events. Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.